What's going on, man?
How about you?
Doing all right. You've probably done this before. I'm not trying to shake you down, but I can't let you play.
Okay. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another day in my life as an advantaged blackjack player. Today, we are making our way into the Chicago area after a very successful session in my last video, which took place at Potawatomi in Milwaukee. We started with a small loss at Oneida, but things turned around quickly after that. I clocked a new session record of $9,450 at Potawatomi, which of course felt great. Between those two sessions, I was up $8,450, and that brought me to a lifetime US total of $84,485. Let's hope I can keep this up. Also, my bad for mispronouncing all the city and casino names in the last video. Hopefully I got them right this time. For anyone new here who's confused, I'm an advantaged blackjack player, and I use the high-low count system to bet higher when the cards are in my favor. If you want to learn exactly what I'm doing, check out my how to count cards video, link is in the description. Just to let you guys know, there is a sponsored ad in this video, so don't be alarmed when it pops up. After leaving Potawatomi victoriously, I made the 1 hour and 30-minute trek into Illinois, with my first destination being Haras Casino in Des Plaines. This place was massive, and they took a lot of action, so I was hoping to fly under the radar for a bit. I mean, where else do you see a table with a $15 min and a $10,000 max? It's just unheard of. They offered a 6-deck hit 17 game here, and there were tons of different tables with various minimum bets. I found myself an empty table with a $50 min and got to work. I was going to be spreading up to one hand of 2,000 or two hands of 1,200, depending on if I was playing solo or not. As always, I'm going to skip through the negative counts. It's not too exciting because I'm just flat betting the table minimum. The true win or loss is shown at the end of the session, which includes all the hands played in the negatives. Near the end of the first shoe, the count hit a true 1, so I raised my bet to $100. I ended up with an 18 versus 10, but the dealer flipped an 8, so we pushed. I played a hand at minimum bet, which was a double that lost, but after this the true count was up to 2. I raised to $300 and was dealt a 13 versus 5. Things worked out great for this one, with the dealer drawing to a bust. Out went another hand of 300, getting dealt 13 again, this time versus 10. I had to take a card, and sadly it wasn't a good one. That was the last hand of the shoe, so let's fast forward. Eventually we made it back to true 1, and I was dealt 16 versus 5. I stood, but the dealer's 18 took me out. My next hand of 100 was dealt 11 versus 10. Time to double. The dealer flipped a 7, so I needed a 6 or better. Well, an ace is not gonna do it. I threw out another hand of 100 and ended up with a 20 versus 10. Dealer flipped a 10, so we pushed. After this, I was dealt 17 versus ace. Dealer drew to 18, so it was no good. This continued on the next hand where I drew to 25. I played a hand at minimum bet, which brought the count back to true 1. I received an 11 versus 10, so it was time to double again. Dealer flipped a 10 for 20, and what do you know, I have another ace. I see how it is. I followed this up with a 17 push, and on the next hand I was dealt a 5 versus 10. This became a 25, so it was lost. This kept up on the next hand as well, with another bust. You'd think after 7 losses in a row, I might win one, but you'd be wrong as I busted out again. Finally, after 8 losses, I turned a 16 into a 21 and beat the dealer. Amazing. My next hand was a pair of 8s versus 3, which means it was time for some splits. My first hand got another 8, so now we were playing 3 hands. I ended up with a 12 and 2 18s. Let's hope the dealer doesn't try anything funny. That is exactly what I was hoping for. Makes those 8 losses hurt a bit less. This continued on the next hand with the dealer busting again. I dropped back to minimum bet for the next couple hands, but it didn't take long to get back to a true 1. My first hand was a 12 versus 3, which I busted on, and my second hand was a 13 versus 2, which was also no good. Finally, the count jumped up a bit to somewhere between true 1 and 2. I raised my bet to $200 and was dealt 15 versus 5. Dealer busted, so I was paid. True count was now up to 2, so out went the $300 bet. I was dealt 17 versus 4, and once again we were blessed with a bust. My next hand was a soft 16 versus 10. I turned it into a hard 16 and stood. Sadly, the dealer flipped a 10, so we were out of luck. I always play using perfect basic strategy, but will often deviate when the count is at certain levels. Standing 16 versus 10 is a deviation that occurs in any positive count. After this, the count dropped back to true 1, and I ended up with a 9 versus 3. Time to double. My 15 ended up being a success as the dealer drew to a bust. I raised my bet to $200 and was dealt a 12 versus 8. I hit and got the 10, so this one was history. My next hand at true 1 was a loss, and I followed that up again on my next hand at true 2. After this, the count was back to true 1, and I received a 16 versus 10. I stood, and of course the dealer had a 10 underneath. My next two hands at true 1 were both losses, so that's nice. The count jumped up to true 2, and my 18 ended up getting crushed by a dealer's 20. Yikes. My next hand was dealt 11 versus 9. Let's hope this double works out. Well, that's just great. Best time to get an ace. True count was now up to 3, so I raised to $500. I was dealt a beautiful hand of 15 versus ace, and before I made a decision on insurance, the dealer had already checked for blackjack.
Yeah, one sec. Too late? I was gonna, yeah. No, don't have it? Okay.
Thankfully, she didn't have it, and technically she saved me $250, but I missed out on a small amount of EV there. My 15 became an 18, and the dealer ended up matching me. True count was now up to 4, so I raised to one hand of 1,000. This next hand was dealt another lovely sight of 15 versus 10. I stood this one, deviating from basic strategy, but it was no use because the dealer flipped a 10. Ouch. I dropped to $500 for the next hand and finally got a 20 versus 9. Dealer wasn't having it though, and this one ended up pushing. My next hand was another 20, and for once I was actually paid. Hooray. True count was now down to 2, and I ended up busting out on my 15. Nothing good to say about the next hand either, because the dealer's 20 wiped out my 18. I played one more hand at minimum bet before the shoe came to an end, and there's really not much good to say about that one. The deck penetration here was pretty and the game wasn't worth much. This means that I was more likely to catch shoes like this, even though I'm playing at an advantage. I played a couple shoes in the negative, and eventually we made it back to true 1. I ended up with an 18 versus 6, and the dealer drew to 22. After this, I was dealt a 16 versus ace. Nothing to do here because the dealer had blackjack. My next hand of 12 versus 10 became a 21, which was enough to beat the dealer's 20. I dropped to minimum bet for a couple hands before we returned to a true 1. I was dealt 16 versus 4, stood, and the dealer drew to a bust. No such luck on my next hand, with my 13 getting beat by an 18. The next hand was a push, followed by a loss. We repeated this pattern for the next two hands with another push-loss combo. I dropped to minimum bet for a hand, but after that we were back to true 1. Nothing exciting here, just a 20 that pushed. This was the last positive count of the shoe, so let's move on to the next. After a while we made it back to true 2, so out went the $300 bet. I was dealt a pair of 2s versus a 6, so let's split them up. The first hand became an 18 and the second became a 9. I doubled the 9, but there is absolutely no chance that it would work out because the dealer drew to 21. Let's hope for no more of that because the true count was now up to 4. I bought in to fund one hand of 1,000. Let's hope for some better cards. Well, that sucks. There goes another $1,000. I bought in again and threw out a hand of 600 as the true count was somewhere between 3 and 4. I was dealt a 14 versus 10 and amazingly pulled a 7 for 21. This one was successful, but overall this shoe was not great. That was the last hand though, so let's fast forward. After a while I was joined by another player, so I switched to my 2-hand spread. True count made it to 2, so out went the 2 hands of 200. I was dealt a soft 14 and 17 versus dealer's 10. I turned the 14 into a 23 and stood the 17. Dealer busted, so this hand broke even. My next two hands were dealt Blackjack and 19 versus 4, finally something decent. My Blackjack was paid 300 and I stood the 19, which ended up pushing. True count was still 2 and I was dealt 14 and 12 versus 7. I busted out on the 14, but there was hope for the 12 because I turned it into a 17. Dealer busted, so we had another break-even hand. After this, the true count jumped up to 3, so I raised to 2 hands of 300. I received a soft 16 and 15 versus 5, which means it was time for some action. I doubled the 16, turning it into a hard 16. Let's hope the dealer just busts. Dealer's 19 killed both my hands. What is going on today? I'm close to giving back all my profits from my last killer session, which never feels great. I tried again with another 2 hands of 300, getting dealt 17 and 12 versus 10. I stood the 17 and turned the 12 into a 22. The 10 magnet is working great today. At least we pushed the second hand with the dealer flipping a 7. My next hands were dealt 15 and 20 versus 9. Amazingly, I turned the 15 into a 19 and stood both. Dealer drew to 17 again, so both of these hands were successful. I dropped to 2 hands of 200 and received a 14 and soft 13 versus 10. The 14 became a 17 and the 13 a 22. Dealer flipped a 9, so there goes my other hand. True count dropped to 1, so I lowered my bet to $100. The losing continued with the dealer drawing to 21. My next hand was dealt a pair of 2s. Dealer was showing 4, so it was time to split. I ended up with 2 hands of 12, which were no use against the dealer's 19. On my next hand, I ended up with a 10 versus 5. For once, can I please have a good double? It's honestly hilarious how bad this game can be in the short term. However, the true count was now up to 2, so I had no choice but to keep at it. I was dealt 20 versus 9, and this one ended up getting paid. True count dropped to 1 for a single hand, which was successful before returning to true 2. You'd think a 19 versus 2 would get paid, but nope, dealer drew to 21. I put another hand of 300 out, which I busted on. Great. The next hand was a 16 versus 10, which again didn't work out. My next hand was basically identical. I was dealt 16 versus 9 and busted out. Not much luck on my next hand of $100 either. I was dealt 17 and the dealer beat me by 1. We made it back on the next hand though with a successful 19. I played one hand at minimum bet before the count shot up to a true 3. I put out the $500 bet and was dealt 18 versus 5. Surprisingly, the dealer drew to 22, so this one was paid. I left my $500 bet out and was dealt a 17 versus ace. True count had dropped below 3, so I didn't take insurance. I stood, but unfortunately the dealer flipped an 8. I dropped my bet to 300 and received a 7 versus 10. It became a 17, which turned out to be a winner. However, I can't say the same for the next hand. I played 2 more hands at true 1, which ended up breaking even. These were the last hands of the shoe, and again, not a great one. All I could do was move on to the next and hope for some better luck. Eventually, the true count made it back to 2, and I was dealt a soft 18 versus 10. No luck here because I busted out. I tried again and finally got a blackjack. It paid $450 and I dropped a minimum bet for a single hand. After that, we got one more hand at true 2, getting dealt 17 versus 10. Nothing good to see here as the dealer flipped a 9. This was the last hand of the shoe, but it didn't take long to hit a true 1 in the next. I threw out my $100 bet and was dealt 20 versus ace. Dealer flipped an 8, so I was paid. True count dropped into the negatives for a single hand before returning to true 1. I received a pair of aces, split them, and ended up with a hand of 15 and 21 versus 6. Dealer drew to 22, so both of these were paid. These were the only positive counts of this shoe, so let's move on. In a later shoe, we were back to true 1. Once again, the 10 magnet came through and I busted out. No dice on the next hand either. My next one received a 20 and dealer drew to 17, so I was paid. I followed this up on the next hand with another win. True count was now up to somewhere between 2 and 3, so I raised to one hand of 350. In came a nice little 20, except the dealer drew to 21. Luck was on my side for this one because the dealer must have miscounted and ended up paying me. We'll let that one slide. I dropped my bet to $300 and was dealt a pair of 8s. Dealer was showing a 7. I split, turning the first hand into 23. The second hand became an 11, which I doubled on and finally got a 10 for 21. Dealer drew to 17, so I was paid. All those small cards brought the count up to true 4, so I raised my bet to $1,000. Sadly, this one was no good as I busted out my 14. I tried again with the same bet, getting dealt 13 versus 7. Once again, I busted out, which is just great. True count was now down to 3, so I lowered my bet to 500. I was going for the hat trick here, and it was a massive success as I busted out this third hand. This was the end of the shoe, and as per usual with this session, nothing good to say. I hopped onto a new table and played some negatives for a bit. After a while, the true count made it back to 1, so I raised to $100. This one, like the previous hands, was garbage. True count was now up to 2, so I upped my bet to $300. I received an 11 versus 4, doubled it, and turned it into an 18. Dealer drew to 17, so this one was a victory. The true count was now up to 3, so out went the $500 bet. I wish I could tell you guys how this one went, but a paranoid pit boss had made his way over. Long story short, he made filming impossible for the rest of the day. After this occurred, he started hawking me pretty hard, and I decided I was going to call it for the day. There were a few more spots in the area that I could keep busy with while waiting for the heat to cool off here. All in all, this session lasted 2 hours and 45 minutes. My average hourly EV was $275, and I was leaving with a loss of $9,775. Not ideal, but I've had worse. As always, the only thing I can do is keep things moving and get to the next table as soon as possible. It's the only way to generate any positive EV and hopefully make some of this back. The next spot I was headed for was a casino called Hollywood in Joliet, Illinois. Here they offered a 6-deck Stand 17 game in the high limit room, and that sounded good to me. I made my way in there, and much to my satisfaction, the table was completely empty. I bought in and started playing the $25 minimum bet. Before we hop into this session, I'd like to quickly talk about today's sponsor. This message is sponsored by Raycon. They offer high quality, stylish earbuds at an affordable price, and to celebrate their anniversary, they're offering 30% off on the Essential Open earbuds. These earbuds are great because they sit just outside your ear canal, meaning they keep your ears open to your surroundings while also delivering a premium audio experience. I specifically like the open ear style because I have earbuds in at the casino anytime I possibly can. With this design, I don't need to constantly take my earbuds in and out when interacting with people because I can hear them perfectly without doing so. Add in a 36-hour battery life and I have a powerful set of earbuds that keeps up no matter what I'm doing. I've used a lot of different earbuds over the years, and I can honestly say that Raycon delivers the same excellent audio quality as the big brands, but at half the price. With over 3 million happy customers and a 30-day happiness guarantee, there's zero reason to overpay. I love using these and I recommend them to all of you watching. Your audio experience will be top-notch, and as a bonus, you'll also be helping support the channel. If you guys are interested in getting a pair for yourself, click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/quattroopen to get 30% off the Essential Open earbuds. Thank you Raycon for sponsoring this video. Let's get back into the action. Around halfway into my first shoe, the count hit a true 1. I raised my bet to $100 and was dealt a 17 versus 10. Dealer drew to a bust, which is a good start to this session. My next hand was similar, with the dealer coming up short. Sadly, I couldn't do it 3 times in a row, and my third hand of 18 was beaten by a dealer 20. The true count was now up to 2, so I raised my bet to 300. I received a 14 versus 2, stood, and the dealer drew to a bust. Nice. I threw out another hand of 300 and was dealt 17 versus 6. Once again, the dealer busted, so this one was paid. Looks like things might be turning around a bit. I guess I might have spoke too soon because my next hand of 11 received a 4 when I doubled. This was not enough to beat the dealer's 17. The true count of 2 was still holding on, so I tried again. The 14 I was dealt did not inspire confidence, but the dealer busted, so I was laughing. We were now up to somewhere between true 3 and 4, so I raised my bet to $800. Finally, we had some hope for a big win as I was dealt an 11 versus 4. Please, no ace.
Oh well.
Well, I suppose it could have been worse. Thankfully, the dealer drew to 24, so this $1,600 double was paid. Let's go. True count was now up to 5, so I raised my bet even further to $1,200. Hell yeah, what a great time to get a blackjack. I was paid $1,800, which is a great step in the right direction. I dropped my bet down to $500, seeing as we were now at a true 3. I was dealt a 14 versus 4, stood, and amazingly, the dealer drew to a bust. This session was shaping up great so far. I followed it up again on the next hand with a successful 19. This just keeps getting better. True count had now jumped back up to 4, so out went the $1,000 bet. I was dealt 14 versus 10, hit it into a 16 and stood. Sadly, this one was not as successful as the last few hands. I tried again with the same bet, getting dealt 16 versus 8. I hit, turned it into a 19, which is a blessing. Dealer matched me, so we pushed. True count was now back up to 5, so I returned to the $1,200 bet. I received a 13 versus 4, stood, and was very happy to see the dealer draw to a bust. For the last hand of the shoe, I raised my bet to $1,500, seeing as the count was true 6. I was dealt a 20 versus 10, and this one ended up pushing. As I said, that was the last hand of the shoe, and what a great one that was. Rivers, Hollywood is where it's at. I got into a new shoe, and it didn't take long for the count to go positive. Here we hit a true 1, so I threw out the $100 bet. I was dealt an 8 versus 7, which I turned into a 19. Dealer drew to 20, so this one was no good. I raised my bet to $300 and was dealt a 20 versus 10. This one ended up pushing. True count dropped to 1 for the next hand, and I was dealt a 13 versus 7. Luckily, I turned this one into a 21. The count went negative for a hand, then back to true 1 where I busted out. Similar story with the next hand, and after that the count was back into the negatives. I played here for the rest of the shoe until eventually I had a visitor.
What's going on, man?
I'll let you.
Doing all right. You've probably done this before. I'm not trying to shake you down, but I can't let you play.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just cast and leave.
Yeah, you're good, man.
The surveillance manager who backed me off here was super cool. I've honestly never met someone like him at a casino. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we talked for a good 15 minutes about AP Blackjack, and he really knew his stuff. If you're watching this, you have my respect. All in all, I played for 31 minutes, my hourly EV was $436, and I was leaving with a profit of $5,300. We needed that one after the murder scene at Rivers. I decided to hit one more spot for the night because it wasn't bedtime yet. There was a casino down the street called Haras, so I decided to head there. I didn't expect to get much time because it's likely they'd been tipped off by the Hollywood surveillance team, but let's check it out. They had a very similar game to Hollywood, some nice 6-deck stand 17. I found the table with the best conditions and got down to work. Before too long we hit a true 1, so out went the $100 bet. I was dealt a 16 versus 10, stood, and the dealer flipped a 9. No good. I dropped back to the minimum bet for one hand, and of course I get the blackjack here, but after this the count was back to true 1. I was dealt a 9 versus 7, which I managed to turn into a winning 21 with some very skillful hitting. I played another hand at minimum bet, but immediately after we were back to true 1. I received a 16 versus 3, stood, and this one ended up being successful. This was the last positive hand of the shoe, so I retreated to the minimum bet. In a later shoe, the count made it back to true 1, so the $100 bet made a return. I pulled a magical 21, which was enough to beat the dealer's 19. My next hand was an 11 versus 8. I doubled, turning it into a 19. The dealer wasn't having it, and he drew to 20. I had some more lucky hits on my next hand, and I ended up with a 20 versus 8. Dealer flipped a 10, so we were in good shape. After this, I had a 17 that pushed, and a 20 that won. I don't know what was going on today with the lucky hits, but I got another unexpected 21 on my next hand. If this can continue on during the high bets, I will be a happy man. I finally lost one on the next hand, but immediately after had a chance to double a 9 versus 4. I turned it into an 11, which ain't pretty. Let's see how this goes. Tough to beat that with an 11. At this moment the count had jumped up to true 2, and since the other guy playing with me decided to leave, I put out a single hand of 300. I was dealt a 20 versus 10, but wouldn't you know it, dealer had blackjack. I dropped back to $100, received a 19, but the dealer's 20 wiped me out. My next hand of 100 was a push, and after that I was back to minimum bets for a couple hands. I ended up busting out on my next hand at true 1, and after this I raised my bet to $300. I was dealt a pair of 3s versus 2, which means it was time for some splits. My first hand ended up becoming a 22, so that sucks. The second hand was basically the complete opposite, with an 11 double that became a 21. Unfortunately, the dealer pulled some bullshit and drew to 21 as well. You've got to be kidding me. Pit staff were starting to hawk my play a bit, so this could be the beginning of the end. I tried again with another hand of 300, was dealt 14 versus 10, and proceeded to bust it out. My next hand was a soft 15 versus 6. Please let me win a double just once. Come on. Finally, I win one on the next hand. Couldn't do it twice in a row though, because my next hand of 20 was killed by a dealer blackjack. What a waste. I dropped to $100 for my next hand and was dealt a 10 versus 4. I doubled, and of course on the smaller bet is when the double works out. Similarly, my next hand of 20 versus 10 also worked out, again on the smaller bet. A win is a win, but the timing could be better. I dropped back down to minimum bet for several hands until the count started to ramp up again. I had a successful $50 hand which I doubled, and all these small cards brought the count up to a true 3. I threw out the $500 bet and was dealt a 15 versus 3. Dealer drew to 20, so this one was history. I tried again with the same bet and was dealt a soft 14 versus 9. I luckily turned this into a 19, which was enough to take home the win. My next hand of 500 was dealt a 15 versus ace. Time to buy some insurance. I'm sure glad I did because the dealer had blackjack. I dropped my bet to $300 for the next hand, getting dealt a soft 13 versus 5. I doubled and turned it into a hard 13. Please bust.
14.
Well, it was right there, but no dice. For the last hand of the shoe, the count was up to true 4. I bought in to fund a hand of $1,000, put it out there, and was dealt a 14 versus 2. I absolutely hate 2s, there's so many ways to make a hand on them, and to rub it in, the dealer drew to 21. Ouch. Well, that wasn't my best shoe. Can't get caught up in the short term though, and as long as I was allowed to play, I was gonna continue doing so. We got into a new shoe and the count quickly hit a true 1. This first one worked out, with the dealer drawing to a bust. I dropped back to minimum bet, but not for long. My next hand of 100 was dealt a 14 versus 10, but I didn't even get a chance to bust this one out because dealer had blackjack. My next hand of 16 was a success after the dealer drew to 26. We got some action on the next one, getting dealt a 10 versus 3. I doubled, turning it into a 13, which was quickly swiped from me after the dealer drew to 18. Sick. We were now up to true 2, and since I was no longer playing solo, I threw out 2 hands of 200. I was dealt a lovely pair of 15s versus 10, which I proceeded to turn into a 23 and 22. True count had now dropped to somewhere between 1 and 2, so I lowered my bet to a single hand of 200. I was dealt a 10 versus 6, how could this one not work out? That's more like it. Just need to do that 15 more times and we'll be back to even. I raised to 2 hands of 300, seeing as the count was now at true 3. I received a 20 and 15 versus 7, which quickly became just a 20 versus 7. Dealer flipped an ace, so we broke even on this hand. After this, I was dealt 17 and 10 versus 10. Of course, the 17 stood, and the 10 became a 20. Dealer ended up flipping a 9, so this was another break-even hand. I left the same bets out and received a pair of 3s and 18 versus 10. The 3s became a 22 and the 18 was no match for the dealer's 20. True count was now down to 2, so I bought in and put out my 2 hands of 200. In proper form, I got a blackjack on the reduced bet as well as a 5 versus dealer's 3. The blackjack was paid 300, nice, and the 5 became a 12. Dealer drew to 20, so there goes that one. After all that, I decided the true count was now a solid 4. I bought in again to fund 2 hands of 500, let's hope for some decent cards. I've definitely had worse, but I'm expecting a push and a loss. Dealer flipped an 8 for 18, so I was blessed with a break-even hand. I dropped down to 2 hands of 200 as the true count had been reduced to 2. My 16 and 6 didn't inspire much confidence against the dealer's 9, and after busting out the 16, I amazingly turned the 6 into a 21. Dealer flipped a 10, so we broke even again. I jumped back to 2 hands of 300 and was dealt a 20 and 9 versus 6. Come on now, time for a successful double. Holy shit, it doesn't get much worse than that. Of course she drew to 20 as well, so my first hand wasn't paid either. This game sucks sometimes. Feelings aside, the true count was now up to 4, so out went the 2 hands of 500 again. I was dealt 16 and 13, which is just great. I stood the 16 and turned the 13 into a 15, which I also stood on, deviating from basic strategy. Of course the dealer didn't bust, so there goes $1,000. I whipped out the wad of cash and bought in for $1,600 because it was time for 2 hands of 800. Again, I was dealt some amazing hands consisting of a soft 15 and a 13 versus 9. I turned the 15 into a hard 16 and stood, and surprisingly turned the 13 into a 20. Well, what an unfamiliar sight that is. Both my hands were paid, and I was left scratching my head wondering what had just happened. I didn't have much time to ponder though, because the true count was now up to 6. I raised to 2 hands of 1,000 and hoped for the best. My first hand was an 11 and my second was a 12. Dealer was showing 10. I doubled the 11 and the dealer came through for us this time. The 12 became an 18, and once the dealer flipped a 10, I was left with a total hand profit of $1,000. Not bad. I dropped the bet slightly back to $800 each. Let's finish this shoe out strong. I was dealt 18 and 15 versus 9, which became an 18 and 17 versus 9. Dealer had every chance to bust here, but drew to 20 in the most annoying way possible. As you guys are seeing firsthand, card counting isn't easy money. Tons of losing goes into this, and you can always lose the next hand. You'll have sessions like this, but the math will work itself out, and over hundreds of hours, the profits will be realized. As always, nothing to do but get into the next shoe. With 17 and 11 versus 10, there was hope for some profits. I doubled the 11, turning it into a 14. Never mind, there's no hope for profits. Dealer flipped a 9, so there goes the $600. I tried again, getting dealt 15 and 20 versus 3. Dealer drew to 18, so we broke even. True count was now up to 3, so I raised to 2 hands of 300. I received a 12 and 14 versus 6, please bust. Scared me for a second there, but it all worked out in the end. The true count had risen slightly to somewhere between 3 and 4, so I settled on 2 hands of 400. I was dealt a soft 14 and 9 versus 2. I turned the soft 14 into a hard one and doubled the 9, which is a deviation. This became a 15, so we needed a bust. Amazingly, the dealer busted for the second time in a row. True count was now at a solid 4, so I raised the bets to 500. They were dealt 19 and 12 versus 10. I stood the 19 and turned the 12 into an 18. Sadly, the dealer flipped a 9, so we lost one and pushed the other. The count was up even further now to true 5, so out went the 2 hands of 800. Pretty much identical to the last 2 hands, I was dealt 12 and 19, and again I somehow didn't bust out on the 12. Dealer flipped another 9, so we had the exact same result as the last hand. I tried again with the same bets and was dealt 13 and 20 versus 5. True count must have dipped below 5 because I chose not to split the 10s, and somehow the dealer drew to f***ing 21. Disgusting. I dropped to 2 hands of 500 and received a 20 and 12 versus ace. I bought insurance to no avail and then proceeded to bust out on the 12. Dealer flipped a 7 for 18, so at least my first hand won. With the same bets out, I was dealt 14 and 12 versus 3. I stood on both, but nothing matters when the dealer pulls 20 or 21 out of thin air every other hand. I bought in again and was definitely catching some more attention at this point. Let's hope I can do a bit of damage control before they back me off. True count was slightly above 4, so I put out 2 hands of 600. I was dealt 12 and 18 versus 8. The 12 became a 22, and the 18 ended up pushing. True count was down to 3, so I dropped to 2 hands of 300. I can't catch a break on any of these hands, and these next 2 were dealt 6 and 17 versus 8. I turned the 6 into a 21, so that's nice, and the 17 ended up pushing. True count was back to 4, so the 2 hands of 500 made a return. The ass cards continued as I was dealt a soft and hard 15. The soft 15 became a 20, and I waved off the other one, deviating from basic strategy. The dealer busted on this one, so celebration was in order. There may be a chance to make even more of a comeback because the true count was now up to 5, and my 2 hands of 800 were both dealt 11. I doubled on both, ending up with a hand of 18 and 21. All we need right now is the dealer to flip a 7. There isn't a better sight than that, especially when you're hella down. Let's hope we can keep this momentum going. True count was now at 6, so the 2 hands of 1,000 were going out. I was dealt 7 and 16 versus 6, and I turned the 7 into a 17. You'd think a dealer bust would be in order, but the cards decided that 21 was a better option. So much for the comeback. Perhaps I spoke too soon because my next hands of the same bets were dealt Blackjack and 19 versus Ace. I took even money because the true count was above 3 and bought insurance for the 19. The insurance bet didn't work out, but the dealer flipped a 6 for 17, so the hand itself was a success. I dropped to 2 hands of 500, getting dealt a 12 and 14 versus 8. I busted out on the 12, but turned the 14 into a 20. The dealer busted, so this was a break-even hand. That concludes this shoe, which is too bad because the count was sky high. I got into a new one, but it seems the surveillance team had decided they didn't like how I played. So before I got a chance to make it back, my session was coming to an end.
I'm not gonna ask that you not play blackjack anymore.
Okay.
You can play craps, roulette, or slot machine of your choice for more blackjack.
Yeah.
They know I'm likely to win it back, so it's in their best interest to have me stop playing. All in all, I played for 1 hour and 16 minutes, my hourly EV was $187, and I was leaving with a loss of $3,450.
Hopefully you're ahead of the game.
I am not.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
That's okay.
You'll get them next time?
Maybe.
All right.
No guarantees. Yeah, take care.
Across all of my sessions today, I had lost $7,925, which obviously isn't what we hoped for, but is very much a part of the job. It honestly could be much worse than this when you bet $2,000 a hand, so there isn't much to be upset about. In my next video, I'm heading back to Rivers on a different shift, which was definitely the right move. I clocked a very long session and generated quite a bit of EV. Don't forget to tune in for that one. That's all I got for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.